In today's video, I'm going to show you how I use focus stacking in macro photography to get pin sharp shots just like this. So to start us off, what is focus stacking and why is it important? Well, in macro photography, even though the subjects that you're taking photos of are very, very small, it's often the case that if you are focused on the front of that subject, the back part might not be in focus. If it's a flower, it may be that some of your petals aren't always in focus. If it's an insect, it's maybe that you focused on the eye stalks, but then its back wings aren't in focus. So the way that you make sure that your subject is in focus from front to back is by taking multiple different photos. In each photo, you change that focus point, starting at the front and moving to the back, and then you combine those images together in Photoshop, and hopefully your photo will be nice and sharp the whole way across. Okay, so let me take you through the setup. Here we've got our subject, and for this video I'm just going to be using this small yellow flower, which I went and picked yesterday in the rain from a big bush with lots of these little things. I think actually is a sort of weed, but it flowers quite nicely. As you can see, I've got this on a clamp just to keep it steady in my shot. My camera here I've got in portrait orientation, and I've got it on a tripod to keep it nice and secure. I've got the main light is a Godox AD200, which I've got firing through the small collapsible softbox, and I've got another AD200 which I've literally just propped up on a battery on this box to cast a little bit of light on this background. The good thing is that this is a really great thing that you can practice at home. You know, you don't need, this is not really a studio setup. I've just got my my camera on a tripod, and I've got a little flower on a little clamp, but you know, you could sellotape a flower to a pencil and stick it in a plant pot or something to have it upright. There's any number of ways you can do that, and these lights are just bog standard Godox AD200 speed lights. Nothing fancy here. You don't need to have a roll of paper as a background. You can use literally anything, or you could not even have a background at all and just have it completely black, which I don't love. I think your subject will get I don't know, it looks a little bit too studio, a little bit, I don't know, boring, I suppose. You know, having something in the background, having some splash of color does kind of help, but it doesn't need to be this. It could just be some colorful wallpaper, or, I mean, Christ, I could have tried to use this dinosaur print that I've got as my background. In fact, maybe I should try that in a future video, using that creatively in a photo. So yeah, it's not a difficult setup. This is something you could do at your kitchen table on a weekend, no problem, and it is a great technique to practice. So I'm using my Canon 100mm macro, but I have also got an extension tube on the front of this. Now what that does is allow me to focus even closer to the front of the lens. So you can see how close that flower is, yet it's going to fill the frame and still hopefully be nice and sharp. I've talked before about the importance of extension tubes, or rather how helpful they can be if you want to get started in macro, because yeah, I have got quite an expensive macro lens on my camera already, but by using those extension tubes you can put them on, say like Canon's nifty 50, a £90 50mm prime lens, and it will turn it into a macro lens. You'll suddenly be able to focus much closer, and you can get close up on those details. The great thing is that these extension tubes are like £30 off Amazon, so it's a really affordable way of getting started in macro. So just taking a look at the flower that I've set up here, as you can see, we've focused on the stamen in the middle of the flower, on that sort of green ball that we've got, and that's looking reasonably sharp. There's a couple of points which are pretty spot on, but it's very clear that the rest of the flower isn't in focus, particularly those petals that are right in the background and also the ones in the foreground. We've very much got quite a shallow depth of field, partly because I'm shooting at f2.8 on this lens, and partly because to get a really good bit of macro, I'm using a extension tube on that lens to allow me to focus even closer. But I don't want a shallow depth of field. What I want is everything in focus looking really pin sharp. That's how this flower is going to look really good. So what I'm going to have to do is take those multiple photos, focusing across the range of the flower, and then piece them together. And I'm going to show you exactly how I will do that. So to start off, I'm going to take my first photo as far back on the flower as possible, which means I'm going to try and focus in right on the back tips of those petals. And I just want the actual edge of those petals where they meet the background. I'm just moving the focus ring until I see those become absolutely pin sharp. And when they are, that's the point. I then take my shot. And then zooming in on the back of camera, I can see that it is absolutely crystal clear on the top edge of the right one. But then as it moves around and comes a little bit closer to the camera, that focus does start to fall off. And it's very clear that the stamens in the middle are not sharp, and of course the petal which is nearer to the camera is completely out of focus. It might be a little surprising that there's so much difference in focus when the flower is so small. You've got to bear in mind though that while this flower is small, it's very close to the lens, so the relative distance away from the front petal to the back petal is actually quite a lot. Certainly enough to completely change the focus point. Now I'm taking these shots at f14. Now that is a very closed down aperture, and normally the bigger the aperture number you have, the more of your scene is in focus. Now it's still obviously not enough to have the entire flower in focus, but it is allowing for more of the image to be in focus each time I take a shot. That's just going to help everything blend together a little more easily in Photoshop. But crucially, what I've got here is my camera secured on a tripod. Now that means that the camera isn't moving, and nor is our subject. Everything is very much staying exactly in line in each image. So what that means is that as I'm changing my focus point on the flower and taking additional shots, the flower and the scene isn't really moving around. So I can blend those different focuses together in Photoshop and everything should line up really nicely. For me, when I've done focus stacking, this is the only really way that makes sense, having everything locked down like this, because it allows you to blend things together without having to shift everything around, and it's just far, far easier. So this is the way I do it in studio when I'm doing product photography or macro shots like this, where I know that I want everything front to back pin sharp. Now, in one of my earlier macro videos, I was out taking photos of insects in the wild, and I spoke at length then about how I don't use a tripod and I can't use focus stacking out in the field. Now, that was for the most part true. It's very, very difficult to do focus stacking when you don't have a tripod because your camera is moving around, your subject might be moving, and it just becomes a little bit unfeasible to do that sort of thing. Strictly speaking, you can do handheld focus stacking. What you need to do is have your camera on a burst mode, and then as you're moving your camera in and out, getting the focus just right on the insect, you hold down your shutter button, keep on firing, and move the camera gently forwards and backwards, which of course will change your plane of focus. It's a little bit more hit and miss than doing it in studio because you're not sure if you've got exactly the images that you need, and of course you need to have a very steady hand making sure you do that. But what can really spoil your image, of course, is that your insect could just leave. And I just find more and more that it doesn't really work for me. What I prefer to do is have a little bit more artful out of focus. You're choosing exactly where on the insect you want your focus to be, usually the eyes of course, and then the rest of it can fall a little more into that blurry, nice out of focus effect. But in studio, you've got a lot more control, so it's much easier to do. And it's the only way that you can get that sort of pin sharp result. If you just search macro insect photography on Google, you'll see loads of results and you'll see that pin sharp thing. Maybe it's one of those compound fly's eyes where the whole of it is pin sharp, and then its antenna are pin sharp and its wings are pin sharp. They've used focus stacking to get that shot. And again, it may be that some of them have been taken out in the wild with real flies that could be moving around. More often they've been done in studio with, unfortunately, sometimes it is with dead insects or ones that have been kept in a freezer because as they're cold-blooded, if they've been kept cold, they move very, very slowly. They take a lot of time to warm up again. As a result, they don't move around a lot and you can get the shots you need. I don't really like doing that. I prefer being out literally in a field, finding real life insects and sort of experiencing their world, as it were. But the other thing that I'm controlling here is the lighting. So what I've got set up here is a Godox AD200 speed light here with a collapsible softbox on the front. Now, this is set to about 1/8 power, and the thing about it is that it isn't moving. Again, this is locked down on a light stand, so the distance isn't moving. That's going to mean that my lighting is even on every single shot that I take. That is crucial. If you're hand holding a light, or if you are outside and the sun goes behind a cloud, then it's potential that one of your focus images is going to be at a completely different exposure to your next one. It's going to make it very different to combine everything together in Photoshop and not having it look really weird. This way I know that I can take a photo and I can change my focus point, take another, and the exposure is going to be absolutely identical on every single one. I always use live view for this sort of work because you can digitally zoom into your scene, make sure that your focus is exactly where you want it to be. In this case, it's on different parts of the petals. So I've got that one, and then I zoom in, getting slightly closer each time, just slightly twisting that wheel, and again, moving it forwards. And as I do, I can see that the focus is being brought forwards, literally moving over that flower. So I know that everything is starting to become nice and sharp in the middle at this point. Each time it's just a very small micro adjustment on the focus, just a tiny little turn. Because what I don't want is for any parts to be left out of focus. The point is that every single bit is absolutely pin sharp. So you don't want to make big focus adjustments. You want to do tiny little tweaks and take lots of photos. It's much better to have more photos with subtle focus shifts than to have maybe 2 or 3 images where you may have actually missed a whole section. And you're going to find it very, very difficult to go back and retake just that shot you'd need. You'd basically have to start from scratch. So we're getting very close to the lens at this point. We're almost at the tiny front tip of the petal closest to the camera, which means we're nearly done. So now I think I've got my first focus stack shot in the bag. I want to try and do something a little bit more creative, and I'm trying to basically get a shot of the flower with a really nice water drop coming off. Looks like it's outside just after a little rain shower. So the way I'm doing this though is firstly I've changed my camera to portrait orientation, and I framed it up so that we've got a nice view of one of the petals sort of slightly bending down, and it's that petal which is going to have the droplets coming off. My lighting setup hasn't changed. I've still got the softbox here, and I've still got my background light, which is giving me a nice shot overall. It's definitely a studio shot because I've got that gradient on the background because of that light. But the way that we're getting the water droplets on is I've actually got a little cup of glycerin. Now this is completely clear like water, but it's very thick. It's more like a syrup. So it's quite easy for me to use these little tweezers, just dip it in. You get a little globule on the end, and I just sort of put that into the middle of the flower, couple of these drops, and then I wait, and eventually it starts to drip down onto the petal, and then it will create a big bubble of this liquid, which will then hopefully drip off in quite a nice way. Once you put the stuff on there, it's all about timing. You've got to make sure that you get your shot exactly as that drip comes down, and it really is trial and error. I've tried a few of these already, and I'm probably going to try a few more just to get that perfect shot. Missed it. Okay, try again, load some more up. I want ideally the drop just coming away from the petal, still in frame and maybe attached to the flower still, but I definitely want it dropping further away. The reason I'm using glycerin rather than water is because it's thicker. Firstly, it travels a little bit more slowly, so it is slightly easier to photograph than just using pure water. But also because of its thicker viscosity, it creates more of these thicker globules, which just looks a lot more attractive to photograph. You get nicer highlights on it, whereas water wouldn't have quite the same effect that we're going for. Okay, we've got a big one coming now. Oh, and I missed it again. My reactions, I'm firing slightly too late to get the nice drip effect. So I'm going to keep on going, put a little bit more, and wait for the drip. Quick, 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 we've got a drip coming. Which I missed. Oh, doing this sort of stuff outside with maybe with a bit of wind or with anything which is causing this stuff to move around is very tricky. So this is really a studio project, but it's fun. I'm enjoying it. Okay, here we go. That's it. That's the one I wanted. That is exactly what I wanted. We've got this awesome droplet of liquid coming down, but it's connected by the strand up to the flower. That looks amazing. But I still want the flower nice and sharp. So now I've got that shot, I'm going to focus stack the rest of the flower quickly. Just make sure that everything else is absolutely pin sharp. And we've got another globule coming down now. That one's even better. That's the one I want. That is absolutely perfect. And that globule of water is sharper than the previous one. That is perfect. That is exactly what I wanted from this shot. Okay, so now I've got my focus stack and I've got my creative water droplet shot. Let's go and take those into Photoshop and see what we can do with them. So I've moved over to Lightroom, imported my shots, and it's this composition actually, which is the one that I want to work on. I really like the way that the flower moves up, and I particularly like that we were able to catch that water droplet. It looks super cool. I'm really, really pleased with how it's come out. I've had a quick look through, and I think actually we can achieve the depth of field and the sharpness that we want with these 4 images. If we have a close look, this is sharp nice on this petal. This one, however, is nice and sharp on the back petal. So hopefully that's giving us enough information to blend everything together. So let's start off by selecting these, and we're going to go edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so we're over in Photoshop now, and we can see that we've got our layers down in the bottom right hand corner all ready to go. So what I think I'm going to do though is I'm going to turn off the what is going to be our bottom layer, which is let's just have a quick look. It's the layer with the water drop, because I'm not going to try and include the water drop shot in the focus stack, because I think it might confuse Photoshop a little bit, because there's nothing else to make the water drop in focus. What we need in focus is the plant, the flower, and we should be able to get that from the other images. So let's just turn everything back on, and we're going to select the top 3. And first of all, we're going to go to edit, and we're going to go auto align layers, because there was a little bit of movement between those. Just my hand being on the camera, on the focus barrel, does shift things around a little bit, so that has just brought everything back in. As we can see, there is this little problem around the edge, which means that it did have to move shots to get them lined up. Now they're lined up, we go back to edit, and this time we go to auto blend. Click stack images and click OK. So at this point, you just have a big slurp of coffee while you're waiting for Photoshop to do it. Good beans. Okay, so apparently we have some issues. Now, Photoshop for the most part is usually pretty good at focus stacking. When I've done focus stacks of maybe watches with 20 or so different images, it's been able to do a pretty good job. Here though, it's apparently been very confused, and it's moved things around, and I don't know what's going on. There's ghosting, there's all kinds of things. There's black back here in the background. There was no black background on any of them, so I really don't know what is going on there. It's very confusing. But the problem is that these masks are very complicated. There's lots going on, and I think it would take probably quite a long time to try and manually go in and just select the areas that we want. So there is another piece of software that I use, which I use on some of my professional shoots because it is a professional piece of software for focus stacking, and it's called Helicon Focus. And I have, just in case, loaded up those images already in Helicon Focus. It's the exact same ones, including the one with the droplet down here. So what we're going to do is see whether Helicon Focus can do a better job. So we'll just click render. It will do its thing much quicker than Photoshop, and also, as we can see, infinitely more accurately than Photoshop was able to do. So we can just have a quick zoom in here, and you can see as we move around, we can see on the left was an original single file, and on the right is how it's managed to combine everything. And as we can see, it's pin sharp across the board, across the whole flower. The rear petals are sharp, the front petals are sharp, the stamen in the middle, sharp. One of the things that we do have, though, that I don't want is some ghosting here, because that leaf will have moved because of the weight of the water droplet on it. But we've got, as we can see, the water droplet dripping down and the water droplet on the petal. We don't need both. So what I'm going to do is, if I click this one, or maybe that one, I suppose, is the one that's bringing in, and we'll go to retouching. Copy parts from source image to resulting image. Oh, okay. So what we're going to do, we've selected the one with the water droplet because that's what we want. And using this brush, we can then brush into our final image more of the water droplet image. It'll probably make a little more sense when I do this. Now we are losing a little bit of that sharpness because we are removing one of the stacked images, but we don't need to do all of it. We just take it just that much. In fact, I'm going to undo that. So okay, that's taking us back to our stacked image, because we don't want to get, I want to try and maintain as much of this sharpness around this part of the petal as possible. So I'm only going to try and brush in the bits that we actually need. And I think when we look at the image in full screen, you won't be able to tell. Everything still looks pin sharp. The water droplet's sharp, the leaf is sharp, everything else in this shot is now pin sharp, which is perfect. So now we can just go to save. So save that as a TIFF image, and then in Photoshop, I'm going to load that back up. And there's our shot. And if we just have a look at how Photoshop tried to stack that image, it's all over the place, and we've got all this ghosting and everything. And then here is how Helicon Focus has done the exact same thing with the exact same source files. It is much, much better, and I think it's only about £50 for a year. If you do a lot of macro, you really want to get into that sort of photography, it's definitely a piece of software which is worth investing in, because trying to mask out just those bits in Photoshop to do it as accurately would be very, very time consuming. And certainly if you're working on, here maybe not too bad with only 3 or 4 images, but if you're doing a focus stack of, say, an insect, and you've taken 40 images, and with each one is just a tiny slither of focus moving back, it would just take so long. And I suspect that no matter how long you spend, you probably wouldn't be able to do as accurate a job as this has done. Either way, that's brought us then to this shot. So there's still a bit more that I want to do just to neaten things up. First of all, I want a different crop. I'm just going to clear that ratio because I don't really like it. And I'm going to move it in, move it down here. Something like that, I think looks really nice with this water droplet perfectly down in this, obeying the rule of thirds, appearing in the bottom right third. Click OK. So already I think that's looking great. First thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to go into filter and camera raw filter. This is going to bring up the same controls that you would get in Lightroom for some easy global edits. It's a little bit on the dim side, so I am going to brighten it up. I'm going to boost the shadows, or maybe drop the shadows a little bit actually. Bring back those highlights on the flower just a little bit. The whites, we could give a little boost, because because I want the flower to be vibrant and noticeable and summery. I don't want it to be too shadowy and hidden away. To that end, I'm going to boost the clarity just a little bit. And we're going to boost the texture as well, because that is going to help add that sharpness and that texture which is going to make it stand out, which is the whole reason why we've done the focus stacking. Dehaze, I don't think I really want to do anything with dehaze at this point. Maybe actually up it just a touch. But then in the hue, saturation, luminance tab, I am going to play with the hues a little bit. I'm going to try and drop those yellows just a little bit. I'm going to bring the greens up to make it a little bit more of an emerald green, because at the moment it's sort of a yellowy green and it gets lost in amongst those other petals. So by bringing it up, it makes it a more vibrant, vivid green, stands out against those yellows. We can darken it down slightly, something like that. It's a little bit overboard, so I'm going to reduce that saturation. The background color I really like. I like the yellow and the purple. I think that's a good color combination. So I am going to try and bring up the brightness a touch. There's not a lot I can do with it, but you know, ramping that right up to the max seems to be okay. And actually I'm going to do the same with the magentas as well. I'm also going to bring up the yellows, and that I think is about it. So I'm going to hit OK and apply those changes. As we can see, it's brightened things up a lot. But I'm going to brighten it a little bit more with a levels adjustment. I'm going to bring those midtones up, but we're going to bring those highlights down just a touch, and maybe down on that, just to bring back a little bit more contrast. Something like that. Okay, I'm just going to merge that levels layer down because I don't think I want to tweak that at all. But now, using the spot healing brush, I'm going to go through and just do a little bit of cleanup on the flower itself, because it was sitting overnight, and so it has sort of degraded a little bit from when I picked it, and I don't think it was brand new when I got it. So there are a few of these little blemishes which I just want to take care of. On here, a couple of these darker little lines. And also there's a couple of little bits of hair and dust which has fallen on it while it's been in my studio. Just helps make it look a little bit more polished, a little bit more like a professional studio macro shot. It's this sort of attention to detail which can separate a mediocre amateur looking shot from something much more high end. If you want to zoom in so you can really see that detail and really see what you're doing, and the healing brush does make it very easy to just click around and get rid of what you don't want. I don't want to go overboard. You know, and these specular highlights look really nice, these little dots, because it really shows that there's nice, it's like a waxiness to the leaves, and shows that they're wet. Which, of course, if there's a big water droplet coming off, then they would be wet, so that's good. But there's a couple of patches in here as well that I'm not too keen on. But even at this zoom level, it's clear that Helicon Focus has done a really superb job with this focus stack. I'm not really seeing any kind of errors that I'd need to be aware of. I think I didn't take a shot which was perfectly sharp right on this front edge, unfortunately, so that is still a little bit soft, but it's not too bad. I don't mind it really. Okay, we have got a little of a problem around here. As you can see, there's this sort of haloing. It is subtle, and I didn't notice it when it was right out. But what we can do, if we just bring in a levels adjustment and really ramp up that brightness, it's only temporary, don't worry, it allows us to see exactly where that error is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to use the clone stamp tool, slightly smaller size, and a slightly higher flow, and we're literally just going to clone stamp in some of that color, and hopefully it's going to look okay when we take off that levels adjustment. It should be fairly easy. We just need to paint in that same color without going too close to the petal itself. I'm going to make it a harder brush and smaller, and it should just let us paint away that slight error that we don't want. Some of these are very subtle, but you know, while we're doing it, we may as well do it properly. Let's just check the other edges. Everything else looks fine. That's all right. Don't mind that. Down here a little bit. So I'm going to use a smaller brush. I'm I'm going to take a sample from over here and paint that in. And maybe without that levels adjustment we wouldn't even notice that, but you know, never hurts to do it anyway. So if we just take that levels off, then no, that basically just, you can't tell anyway. So I think we're okay. And if we go back and have a look at this, as we can see, it's yeah, that's pretty much taken care of. So we can go back out, fit on screen. I think I did notice a couple of marks on our background paper. So again, I'm going to bring out our spot removal tool and just paint over those, and then they're going to disappear. Because I want a really nice, neat looking background, and those little spots might be noticeable. And a great way of finding them is by moving your canvas around, by holding spacebar and dragging with your mouse. And as I do, I can see that there is quite a big patch here and here a little bit. So I'm going to right click on the spot healing brush tool, select the patch tool, and then roughly draw around it and literally drag it to a new place, deselect, and looks like that's pretty much taken care of. The other ones are too subtle, I can't be bothered doing anything with those. Maybe that a little bit. I do tend to be a little bit of a perfectionist with this sort of thing. You might never need to go to this much detail. If you're doing commercial work and this was for a client, then absolutely you would want to go to this much effort to clean up your shot. But if it's just for your own work, then it doesn't matter. But then if it's for your own work, then, you know, take all the time you need. You know, you're not working to deadlines, you're not trying to get work out for an advertising schedule or anything like that. You can spend as long as you need cleaning it up, and you should do. A couple of bits on the water droplet. There's that little reflection. A couple of little bits. I want it to look nice and clean, so I'm going to take out some of these. I'm going to take out this. I think that was reflecting my light, maybe. Yeah, we don't want too much. It makes it a little bit of a complicated reflection, and what I want is for it to be pretty neat and even. Let's just have a quick look at that. Yeah. So what I'm gonna do. Oops. Zoom in a little bit more. I'm gonna create a new. No, I'm not going to create a new layer. We're already on a new layer. I'm going to take a sample of that. It should just be black. And with the brush tool, smaller size, we're just going to paint over this sort of grey reflection. I like this strong highlight on the right. I don't like that sort of weird grey in the middle. And up here it blends to the purple, looks really, really nice. So I think just getting rid of that little bit looks really great. And if we have a look out, when suddenly we've got a much cleaner looking water globule. In fact, if we zoom in and just turn it off and on, yeah, suddenly when it's on, we can see all these reflections of the studio. We don't like it without it. Really clean and it looks great. We still get the reflection of the purple in the background and on here, and then we get this nice highlight. The rest of it is fine. I just think that looks a lot better and a lot more, as I say, like a polished sort of shot. But I want to emphasize this water droplet a little bit more. And the way I'm going to do that is by duplicating this background layer again, going to filter, going to camera raw filter, and I'm going to, if you'll bear with me, add in some clarity, add in some texture, add in some highlights, maybe some shadows, and maybe a bit of white as well. Now, if we click OK, then we're going to see that the image has gone very crunchy, and it's not a good look for the whole picture. But that's fine, because what I'm doing is I'm going to use an adjustment, I'm going to use a layer mask, invert it so it's black, which means that it's not applying anywhere. And now if I paint with white, it's going to reveal that layer. It's going to reveal the clarity and the texture that we've just put on in the camera raw filter. So now we can just literally go in, paint in that effect onto our water droplet, which is going to boost those highlights. It's going to emphasize that bit of clarity that we use. That should do it. And if we turn that off and on, again, it's subtle, but it does make a difference in the whole image. But I actually think I could make it brighter as well. So I'm going to use a levels adjustment. I'm going to bring up that mid-tone. I'm going to bring up the highlights too, actually, quite a bit. And again, invert that layer mask. We don't want it applying to everything. And I'm going to paint it back in selectively on just those bits that we want. Use a smaller brush and paint it up here. Not going on the leaf this time because it'll make the yellow too bright and we don't want that. But I am painting it around the highlights, painting it around all parts of our droplet. Turn that off and back on. Suddenly that purple really stands out, and when you look at it in the full screen, it looks great. It looks really, really good. Your eye is drawn to it. I think, yeah, I'm very, very pleased with how that looks actually. But I am going to go back into another camera raw, and the way I'm going to do that is by holding Alt or Command, layer and merge visible, and that's going to merge everything onto a new layer, which I can then go to filter, camera raw filter, and we're back in here. And I'm going to up those whites first of all, and maybe the exposure generally because it's still a little bit dark. Highlight's going to touch down. I actually am going to add a bit more clarity to the whole scene, but not texture. If we add texture, then it starts to go, you know, very weird and almost like paper. Don't want that. So we're going to keep our texture exactly where it was. And at this point, I haven't decided what else I want to do. It is a case, as I often do with these things, is about looking at it, thinking, what else do I really want to get from this shot? And I think one thing that I want to do is I want to add in a graduated filter down here, darkening it up. Just hopefully just going to draw the eye a little bit more to the middle of the frame. And then maybe another one on the top edge. And then I think maybe using an adjustment brush, I am going to bring the exposure down just a bit on that bit of leaf, because it was the bit that was nearest my flash, and the way that it's been angled, it's just catching all of the light from that flash, so it's brighter than the rest of the flower. So by bringing that exposure down just a little bit, it's just helped balancing it out. If you look without, it's very, very bright, and then we just bring it back down so those tones match a little bit more the rest of the flower. But that's everything that I want to do with that right now. So I'm going to press OK, and as I say, everything's kind of gone back a little bit. I think that looks a lot better. One thing I do want to try though is just doing a bit of dodging and burning to try and bring out a little bit more of the texture in the center of the flower. So I'm going to do that by creating a new layer, edit, fill, and fill with 50% gray. Now we've got a gray screen. We then use a overlay blending mode, and what that'll allow us to do is if we paint with white, then it lightens the image. If we paint with black, it darkens the image. Obviously, those are very extreme examples, so what we do is we use a very, very low flow. That's going to allow us to just build up that effect the more we paint on. So I want to do that around here, adding in some extra shadow to where there already is some shadow, but we don't really have enough. So by painting some extra shadow in, it's hopefully going to give a little bit more texture to this middle bit of the flower. It's going to suggest shadow a little bit more. It's going to let these green things stand out in a way that they all sort of blend together into one at the moment, and I don't really love that. I'd like them to have a little bit more definition, and this is the way you were going to do it. Swap to white and paint white on those highlights to help bring those out. And whilst we've got our white up, we're going to do the same on some of these panels. Slightly bigger brush, painting in some extra detail on these leaves because they're a little bit dark, a little bit shady. I want to bring out a little bit more. What this is really doing is adding a little bit more shadow where there already is shadow, a little bit more highlight where there already is highlight. So it's basically adding a little bit of contrast, but it helps define things a little bit more, and you have a bit more control over how to do it. In my experience, there's no real right or wrong way to do it. You can very much overdo it, but even then, you know, you can dial it back because it's on a new layer. So you can just take that opacity down or just get rid of it altogether. But I do find it a very good way of just painting in the light a little bit more where you want it to be. Also, hopefully using it here to take control of some of these highlights a little bit and just keep those under control. Maybe even swap it around and add in a bit more brightness to some of these parts. We've already added a lot of brightness to the droplet, so we don't want to go nuts there. And fit on screen, if we just turn that off and on, we can see, particularly in the green in the middle, it's adding a lot more texture. So I really, really like what that's doing. It might be a little bit too much. I'm just going to bring it down to about 80%, no, 70%, just to make it a bit more subtle. But I think I'm pretty pleased with that overall. So I think I'm going to call it a day on this shot here. I've got pretty much everything I want. I really like that the flower itself is so sharp front to back. Yeah, there's a couple of little errors, but I'm overall very pleased with that. And having that water droplet, I think really transforms this shot into something much more exciting. Because I didn't intend to have the water droplet there when I started shooting, but it's just a thought I had as I was getting some of my test shots. I'm really glad that I experimented with it and I took the time to get the timing just right so that it's coming off, but you still get that nice globe of water, which yeah, I think transforms this shot from what would just be a pretty boring picture of a flower into something with a lot more dynamism going on. So yeah, definitely something that's worth experimenting with if you are wanting to take some creative macro shots at home. But hopefully this has been a helpful video. Hopefully you've learned some techniques about how to do your own focus stacking. As I say, do look into Helicon Focus if this is something that you think you're going to be doing a lot of. It's a very, very good piece of software, very high-end pro software, and for 50 quid a year, it's actually not too bad. If you have found this video helpful, do please hit that like button, subscribe if you don't already, and I will see you next time.